everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap with me, Emma Turner, and my co-host John Hutchinson. Hi John.
Hello, how you doing?
Oh, I'm very well. It's my first week of half term. We only get 1 week here in Leicester, but it's half term, so I'm feeling very relaxed but equally very excited about our guest today.
Yes, me too. It's Aziza and I've worked together over the last couple of years a little bit, and so it's really fun to be able to sit down and have a proper relational one-to-one and dive a little bit deeper into all of the great work that you've been doing.
So welcome, Aziza. Our guest today is Aziza Ajak. So I am absolutely delighted to have you on. Welcome to Mind the Gap, Aziza.
Thanks so much for having me. I feel like a proper celebrity on Mind the Gap. So yeah, this has been my week.
Oh, it's a night. And you're our first guest after we just found out we've got 250,000 listeners now. So no pressure, Aziza. No pressure. But I've been wanting to get you on for quite some time now. I saw you years ago speak at a Women Ed event, and I've thought about what you said on that day so many times and shared your thinking with so many people. So I'm delighted you've joined us today. But for those people who haven't heard you speak, haven't heard about your work, haven't had the pleasure of finding out about your wit, warmth and wisdom, just an overview of your kind of journey into teaching and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, amazing. So I started teaching in 2014. Actually, as a teenager, I wanted to be a teacher, a head teacher in particular, and then went to university and realised that there was so much more that I could do. And so I dabbled in a few other things before joining the profession. I worked in Camden for 2 years and then joined a startup free school where I was there for 8 years, which, you know, if you've done that startup journey, you'll know just how incredible it is to be part of a school's journey for that period of time. And then I've recently just moved to a new school working in Hertfordshire with Future Academies Trust as vice principal, which is really exciting. And on the side, because obviously I have loads of time, you know, being a full-time vice principal, do a few other things on the side. So I am trustee of Mission 44, which is a charitable foundation. It's a grant-making organisation that was set up by Sir Lewis Hamilton. And I also co-chair a network called 100 Black Headteachers, which is trying to increase the visibility and representation of Black people in headship. So yeah, a few things that I do on the side alongside the day job.
And I remember hearing you speak as well, Aziza. One of the things that blew me away was the way that you collect master's degrees like other people might collect Pokemon cards. I just remember thinking, wow, this woman is truly phenomenal. But John, how do you know Aziza? How have you connected with her work before?
Well, we work together a little bit because we have a shared interest on sort of system coherence, educational coherence, thinking about a child and a family's journey through the educational system in a kind of more holistic and coherent way. And so Aziza and I worked together on our Cradle to Career partnership, where we were both trying to do this almost impossible mission of thinking about how do you join up primary and secondary for kids and for families. And so I guess that's my first question is Aziza, how, like, what did you kind of learn through that? What were the kind of big opportunities, successes? What made that kind of work hard of thinking about sort of, especially from curriculum and teaching, getting sort of coherence and consistency the whole way through a kid's journey?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. So I think part of the draw to the startup school that I joined was that it was an all-through school. And for me, it was an interesting model to essentially see a child from 3 years old all the way to 18. And so I was really excited to be joining that kind of project. I think as time progressed, the reality of trying to join up that experience for a child became hard. It was difficult to do that. I think we started with kind of reception in year 1 and then year 7, and then you had this kind of almost donut model where you had children in the year groups at either end, but nothing in the middle. And that made it really hard to build a coherent curriculum that went all the way through. So I think by the time we got to the point where our first kind of the founding cohort that were in reception had got into secondary school, it was really obvious at that point that we needed to invest some time into this piece of work. And And initially I totally underestimated it. So it was kind of my job to bridge the two. And I thought, you know, I'll give us a year and we'll have this coherent curriculum that goes all the way through and it'll be amazing. And then I just failed at it because I totally underestimated how big the job was. And so we'd managed to make some ground, I think, in setting an overarching vision, joining up our kind of curriculum principles in some way, shape, or form. But I'd underestimated some of the challenges in primary around subject leadership. We sort of hit barriers around kind of logistics, and those who work in all through schools and in primaries and secondaries will know some of those issues. And so I think the cradle to career partnership and piece of work was then really key, because all of a sudden you're sat around a table with other people who are also experiencing those challenges, some who may be slightly ahead of you and can sort of give you hints and tips and tell you about the mistakes that they made. And so for me, I think the most powerful thing was being able to connect with other people on that journey and to sort of tease out some of the challenges that we were experiencing, and then to be a little bit more realistic about what we were trying to achieve in a particular time frame.
And I'm really interested in this kind of primary to secondary transition. So what were the challenges there? What were the barriers? And then what was the learning potentially?
Yeah, I think in our context was slightly unique because we had sort of two separate senior leadership teams. Right, you know, you had one for primary and one for secondary. So that in itself was a barrier. Like, how do you get all those leaders on the same page around what curriculum means? Because there's, you know, so many definitions of curriculum. And then what do we mean by the principles that we've established? And so that was the starting point, was to try and get leaders on the same page about that. And we, in secondary, had probably done quite a lot of thinking about curriculum. And so we had a really clear understanding of the words we were using, but then very quickly realized that those words had different meanings to those primary colleagues. And so that was the first thing that we had to overcome, was just sort of getting on the same page around that. But then there was logistical things around finding time for subject leaders in both phases to meet. And, you know, it's much easier for secondary colleagues who've got their kind of fixed PPA slots, but then it was quite a challenge to get primary staff kind of off timetable with how their PPA works. So even things like that were hard and difficult. We hadn't typically done lots of insets together, and you know, what does it look like to bring all staff together and then start talking about our kind of vision for curriculum. So some really, I think, profound logistical challenges that we faced.
There's another, I don't know if you found this as well, Aziza, but we found this because Reach was obviously also a startup, you know, starting in 2012, and there's a kind of beautiful opportunity, which is because you just have a reception year and a year 7, all minds can just be on that sort of small cohort of children, and you can kind of like build it as you fly and think what's right for this group of children at this time. But then that becomes a little bit of a double-edged sword, because it's then at some point in the future you blink and you think we're a full school and we've got children coming all the way through and be making these decisions kind of in a very, very bespoke way. But now we have sort of children moving through each year, and we look at it and we think, look, what's happening is great in each year group, doesn't necessarily join up though. I don't know if you had like a similar experience of the kind of startup to kind of established school
No, definitely that resonates. And I think initially we had sort of foundation subject teachers in secondary teaching and primary, because we could do that because we had the flexibility to do that. So it was sort of, oh, this is really exciting. We've got, you know, French being taught in primary and music being taught in primary by specialists. This is amazing. But as the school continued to grow and all of a sudden you've got more children and a bigger timetable to staff and money gets tighter, it was harder and harder to continue that model. And then before you knew it, you sort of looked back and thought, those really core things that we decided that we were really excited about haven't quite translated over the years. I think the other challenge that we had was our primary was 3 form entry and the secondary was 4 form entry. And there were some changes in primary numbers as well that meant that we had a significant proportion of children coming from about 33 different feeder schools. So then you have this challenge of, well, we can create this great primary curriculum, but we know that we're going to have a significant proportion of children that will have had a different experience in terms of their curriculum. And that was a challenge for our subject leaders in secondary in particular, thinking, well, I need to get these foundations right because I know that I'm going to have children with various different gaps. And And so I'm not even sure we quite kind of solved that issue, but that was definitely something that we struggled with.
It's interesting in that kind of free schools setup, or that startup school setup, because it's that blank page, isn't it? It's that kind of, you can do everything and you can almost be paralyzed by opportunity because there's so much that you could do that you end up not, I don't mean doing nothing, but doing trying to do everything, and then and potentially getting yourself in a bit of a professional knot, which you've articulated there. Which brings me on to the idea about school context. So the startup schools had its own context, but you work and write quite a lot about working in schools that are, as Phil Naylor's book title says, harder than others. And I was absolutely fascinated by your chapter in there on curriculum, which we've just touched on, about writing a curriculum for schools, and potentially some of those schools, like it says there, that are harder than others. And I was interested in you kind of articulating the key messages from there about, you've already touched about how you define the curriculum, how you make decisions about the curriculum, about curriculum content, and just about some of those challenges that you talk about in those chapters there. And if you haven't read it, go and read it, because I have highlighted so much. I think I've only got the full stops in there that are actually not highlighted now.
It was a really interesting conversation with Phil, and obviously I'd recorded it about a year before it was published, so going to kind of read it back, I was sort of like, oh, I said that's interesting. And I think whilst I talked a lot about curriculum, it was much broader than that. I think about the importance of context and the decision making as a result of that context, and so I think that, you know, we had a really clear vision at Goresbrook School, which was about ensuring that our children and young people had the real option to go to top universities. And it was a deliberate vision. It was the vision that was there from inception and still exists today. And that vision sort of guided all of our decision making around teaching, curriculum, behaviour, like everything in the school. And for me, kind of having led on curriculum through various years in the time that I was there, the decisions that we were making about curriculum were very much about how do we ensure that when our students get to university, that they can excel in the same way that their more affluent peers can excel. And as a result, that then meant we had to make some really bold decisions about what we were going to deliver and what we weren't going to deliver. And, you know, there was lots of conversations about, you know, DT, for example, and computer science. And, you know, initially you couldn't offer those subjects because it was just too small. But then there was a point where you could start to offer those subjects. And, you know, were we going to introduce them at the expense of another subject? You know, we made a decision about music, for example. So our students had 2 music lessons a week. One was a kind of standard music lesson. The other one was a big band music lesson where every child got group tuition and learnt an instrument. And that was deliberate. We wanted every child to have the real option to be able to do GCSE music. And we know that if you can't afford, you know, tuition, then you've got no hope of doing GCSE music or doing A-level music, which is a great subject. So we'd made a decision that we were going to have these 2 music lessons. And then when you're sat there making a decision about, well, do we introduce DT now? And if we introduce DT, what in our curriculum are we going to compromise to make the space for DT? And that was a really hard decision, I think, for us to make. Do we move to a carousel model where you're doing, you know, art for a term and then, you know, DT for the next term, and what does that look like? And there were some really difficult decisions, I think, to make about what we were going to offer just in terms of subjects to our students. And we deliberately given quite a lot of time to core, particularly English and maths, knowing that, you know, securing those grade 4s was fundamental to opening doors for our students beyond that point. So there were some really tough decisions, I think, to make for us, knowing the context about what subjects we were going to offer to students and where we were going to be bold and say, we're not doing this and this is our rationale for not doing it. And it's because it's the right decision for our context and for our children and young people.
Is that similar to your work, John?
I think so. What I love about that, Aziza, is just how honest you are about as a team about trade-offs, because this is one of my bugbears in education. There are always trade-offs. The way that we set up everything, assessment, exams, the curriculum that we offer in schools, there are always trade-offs, and there are trade-offs in terms of what we can do for the whole school community, but there's also trade-offs in terms of we have finite resources, and there may well be a conversation of, if we invest this time on kids kind of on the 3-4 grade boundary for English, it may be that actually some kids that could have got an 8 or a 9 in English are not necessarily going to get an 8 or 9, because we have to put the resources, and being honest about those trade-offs, as you've sort of spoken about, I think is just has such integrity. And just to pick at that a little bit more, was there a kind of a key principle or a key set of principles that you drew on when you're making those trade-offs and you're saying, look, we need to decide, are we going to offer a DT or not DT? Was there a kind of a North Star or a set of key principles you would use to kind of agree on those trade-offs together?
So I think we had a sort of common understanding of our context. So we knew that there were literacy deficits. There are real deficits, and I don't really like the term cultural capital, but everyone sort of understands what that means. So we knew that there was deficits in terms of cultural capital. And so we were very kind of driven by our kind of context, is that we need to make, literacy and reading, a core part of our curriculum because of our students' starting points. And then we need to make sure that they get broad experiences in subjects that we know their more affluent peers are going to experience. And if we're serious about getting them into those top universities, then we need to expose them to those sorts of things. So I think the context was very much our kind of a driver there. And I think the other thing, if I'm honest, was just the kind of recruitment piece. We were in Barking and Dagenham, really tricky to kind of recruit for. And if we're going to introduce something into the curriculum, we better be able to find a great teacher and know that if for some reason that teacher left, that we'd be able to replace them with a great teacher. And there was lots of conversations about computer science, for example, knowing that that's a really tricky subject to recruit for. So we weren't going to introduce it into the curriculum if we couldn't guarantee that we'd be able to deliver high quality teaching in that subject area. So I would say that those are probably the two main things that we use to sort of make decisions around those trade-offs.
Mm. And you talk a lot as well about the importance of maintaining that quality of teaching as well. And I'd be interested to hear, because you talk quite a lot in the writing about consistency and having that shared approach to not just the curriculum design, but then at the point of enactment and teaching, how you get that teaching right. So I was interested to hear about your thoughts and how you created and maintained and had that shared approach, that shared consistency.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we used to refer to what we called curriculum equity, which was the idea that we had this kind of shared curriculum that was written by our subject experts, and every single child had an entitlement to that shared curriculum. It was deliberately pitched. So we talked about our curriculum being pitched to just above the highest attaining pupil in a year group, and that all our resources were pitched there, and that we planned backwards from an A star at A level all the way down. And the expectation was, regardless of what set that you had as a teacher, you were exposing every single child in that class to that curriculum and to the level of challenge in that curriculum. It wasn't necessarily curriculum equality, because actually there's times where you need to respond to the children that you've got in front of you. You might need to adapt. There might be places where you slow down or speed up depending on the group that you have in front of you. But ultimately that it was an entitlement that every single child had exposure to that full curriculum. We were also really fluid in terms of children moving between sets and groups. And so we had a narrative that if you would be disadvantaging children if you narrowed what they were getting, because if they then moved into a different class and then couldn't cope with that because you'd somehow narrow the curriculum, then that you would be doing them a disservice. So that was something that we held on to really tightly at the beginning, and it was really easy to do that when you had two teachers basically teaching all children, or it was one teacher teaching every single group. It was easy to do that. It became much harder as the school grew, and then you've got bigger departments and lots more people teaching that. So what we had to do was then think about our professional development offer to make sure that our teachers were able to deliver that curriculum to the expectations that we had and not narrow the curriculum in any way. And so we moved from a model where we had lots of whole school CPD to having subject-specific CPD. So we made some kind of bold decisions, really, and that came at a financial cost to the school, but it was well worth the money to protect a slot within the timetable for departments to meet. And then our CPD time after school was largely also in departments. So we had kind of two models. One was a sort of curriculum meeting, which was more about subject expertise, where, you know, head of department would identify, for example, I don't know, in year 8, we're teaching X. This is typically quite hard to teach or explain, and they would practice their explanations in that time before then delivering it to those classes in that week. And then the other slot within the timetable was used to do sometimes collaborative planning or to go on joint learning walks, so to go and see teaching happening across the school, discuss what they were seeing, and then think about the sorts of things that they could take away for their own teaching. So we kind of had a really clear set of principles around the curriculum and curriculum design and the centralized curriculum and why we were doing it. And then we had to back it up with providing that time in that space for our subject leaders, who are the experts, to be able to develop their teams that are delivering that consistency in the classroom.
Your bit about scripting that you've just mentioned and about the explanation, how to do an explanation, has stayed with me since I heard you speak all those years ago, when you were saying about when you come to teach something, you saying how it works, or, you know, how it fits together, or modeling it. The first time you hear it shouldn't be the first time you explain it. You should have practiced and practiced and practiced that explanation so that it's fluid and it's rehearsed. And I remember you saying, practice it in the car, practice in front of the mirror, practice, practice, practice. And no one had ever, so I'd never heard anybody be that explicit about the importance of really clear explanation. So it's really interesting to hear that that was carried through across your departments in your school. Yeah. What was the impact of it?
I mean, I think the impact is great results, right? So our first year, our P8 was 0.97, and has been above 0.8 since that point. And so I think the outcome of that is we've had great results. And if I think about our best department, you know, our English department averages about 50% of children getting a 7+ on average each year. And that is, and if you go into English, like, those teachers are consistent. Like, that is a department where there is total consistency, and you're walking into those classrooms and they're delivering the curriculum in an incredible way, and it's responsive to the children in front of them, but it is totally consistent. And it's nothing amazingly show-stopping like you see it, and it's just good teaching delivered every single day, and it's resulting in half of children in one of the most deprived boroughs in the country getting a 7+. Like, that's the outcome, and that comes from a great curriculum that's been written by those subject leaders, and then that consistency and that rehearsal and that scripting. And I think the thing to say about that is that having really high quality centralized resources should free up teachers for that intellectual prep and that practice of their explanations. And that's what we invested time in, so that we could free up our teachers to do that, and then provide as much time as we could within the confines of a school day for them to do some of that collaboratively as well as independently.
I'm smiling because I'm just giggling myself, saying it's just good teaching. I'm thinking, this is not just teaching, this is M&S teaching.
You see, I go to football, and I think that he's talking a little bit like Gary Neville. Like, Gary Neville he never had 10 out of 10 in the match stats afterwards. He was always 7 or 8 out of 10, but he was also never 6 out of 10. He was just so solidly reliable. And it's what you're talking about sounds sort of similar. Or the James Clear, like, Atomic Habits. Like, you kind of, if you want to write a book, you don't not write for 12 months and then blast one Sunday all day long. Like, you have to write a paragraph a day every single day. That's what writes a book.
Oh, and you've touched, Aziza, on staff development there, which I know is a subject close to your heart for many reasons, both at school level, but both at system level. Just talk us through some of the work that you're really focusing on, really interested in terms of both school-based staff development and some of the wider projects that you're involved in as well.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting going into a new school, that sort of development journey at the moment, and thinking about applying all that I've known and experienced about staff development in a context where we have to rapidly improve outcomes. And for me, the only way for us to do that is to get professional development right, for those members of staff. And I've applied very similar things. I think investing in, that there is a place for whole school CPD, and I think it's important in the context that I'm in, just to kind of establish a commonality about what's expected and to provide room for deliberate practice. But we also have the subject specific training going on a weekly basis, where they're in departments, working on quality of their explanations and planning and all those sorts of elements. And so I believe that really in schools we have to have a combined approach, where there is the whole school stuff around the teacher behaviours that is just good teaching across the board, and then you've got to have that subject specific work, and where you maybe don't have the expertise in the school, then tapping into expertise elsewhere. And I'm lucky to work in a trust now where their central team and trust subject leads are excellent, and are very much on the ground and helping to deliver some of that training, which means that what the teachers are getting is really high quality, and I'm confident that it's going to result in us making gains really, really, really quickly. I'd say in kind of beyond the classroom, the other thing that's on my mind is professional development around leadership. And the other thing that I noted about this school was, whilst we need to make teaching better, we also need to make leaders in the school better. And if we can make leaders in the school better, that's going to result in sustainable change, because we'll have effective leaders that are able to develop their own leaders and spot and nurture talent. And then all of a sudden we've got this cycle of good people growing our own people and doing that piece of work. And in Hertfordshire, and I'm learning this, I thought recruitment in Barking and Dagenham was tough, and then I've moved to Hertfordshire, and now I'm like, oh, this is a whole different beast.
Anywhere with a sheer at the end of it.
Yeah.
Recruitment nightmare. I could say anywhere that ending in sheer.
Yeah. So I've had to think very deliberately now about kind of leadership development and how we grow our own. The trust has got a great skip program, and so those skips are amazing. But how do we keep them? How do we grow them and turn them into great leaders? And so I've been thinking more about that leadership development piece, and really that centers for me on like line management and one-to-ones. And I spent a lot of time thinking about those weekly opportunities where you've got an SLT, line manager, and a middle leader in a meeting. And how can you make that developmental? How can you ensure that that drives forward improvement? How can you make sure that the person receiving that line management feels valued and a part of the organisation and a part of driving forward change? And so I've put quite a bit of thought into how to get that model right. Done a bit of reading about it. There's a book that's all about one-to-ones, which basically talks about how terrible they are, and how there's so many of these one-to-ones that happen across the business sector, and no one's really spent very much time thinking about how to make one-to-ones great and really effective. So yeah, doing some exciting work there, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because it's something you don't really get trained for as a leader. You're doing a good job as a teacher, and you think you've got some ideas around leading a department or pastoral, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, and you're line managing these 6 people or whatever, and other than the way that you line manage, there's often not a clear kind of induction into this is how you organize a line management meeting or line management over time. And as you said, like, to what extent it's about development, to what extent it's about sort of accountability. But it sounds like you've cracked this, so tell us.
I don't know if I've cracked it, but so our model is there's a check-in. I'll talk about that in a second, and then there's either a development activity or a development discussion, and it's centered around a leadership framework that we've created. So there's 3 parts of the leadership framework: leading self, leading people, and leading performance. And so we've mapped out sort of the types of development discussions and development activities that sit alongside each one of those headings. I've actually stolen it from somewhere else, so it's really not my own idea, that framework, but I think it's spot on in terms of like that. Those are the things that I think leaders need to be able to do. I've got a real emphasis on the leadership of self bit, because I think that is just an undervalued bit about being a great leader, and actually being self-aware, knowing what your strengths are, what your blind spots are, knowing how to prioritize. I thought I was a really organized person, and then I became a senior leader and that all went to pot. that sort of like, you know, practical stuff around being a leader, but being vulnerable and all those sorts of things, which I think are really important to being an effective leader. And then the meeting starts with a check-in, which is sort of 15 to 20 minutes. Been very deliberate about that check-in. So for example, I ask all of the senior leaders to ask how that person is and to ask them to rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. And I got this from the book actually, but typically when you ask someone how they are, they'll say fine. Happens in schools all the time, and there's lots going on under the surface. If you ask them to rate themselves between 0 to 10, it gives you much more information about where they're at, and then you can start to probe. So it's become a really fundamental part of how we start line management meetings, just to sort of build that relational trust and connect with the person that you're line managing. We then check in on actions from the previous week, and then move into either a development discussion or development activity. Those are all centralized, so we're doing the same thing in all of our head of department line managements, and then all of our pastoral line management meetings. Super practical, you know, it could be things like a booklet, it could be things like doing a data analysis piece of work together and writing a development plan. It could be going on a joint learning walk with that person and looking at some teaching together. Development discussions tend to center on the school priorities or the priorities for that department. And then we try and build opportunities for feedback. So both ways, either giving that middle leaders some feedback or them giving feedback about, you know, an element that we've changed in the school or their kind of experience of what's going on in school.
I love that. Do you know what I love so much about that? I think that's, first of all, thank you for sharing that framework. There was so much in there that I think people will find extremely helpful. But what I love is thinking as a middle leader or a teacher, if I was coming into line management with you, I'd be thinking selfishly, I'd be thinking, I'm going to tick something off my to-do list in this meeting. Because I don't need to think, oh, I need to apologize for not having done the booklet. Yeah. We'll do the booklet together, and I'll get somebody who's more experienced and expert than me to kind of guide me through that process. I think that's a brilliant model.
Yeah, and we're deliberate. You know, one of our principles is mind the load. Like, we don't want people leaving those meetings with like 10, 15 items on their to-do list they then have to go and do. That's going to cause them stress. And if you are setting actions, then there's a very clear conversation about, well, what's realistic? Like, when do you think you'll be able to get X and Y done, and let's pick the ones that we need to prioritize here and the ones that might need to wait a little bit longer.
What I find fascinating about that, Aziza, as well, is that when you move from class teaching into a senior role, you've kind of been on your own for ages, potentially, and nobody actually teaches you how to do the leadership bit. So I'm just imagining that leaders early on in their career who are moving into that structure have such a useful system to begin to craft their leadership development within, rather than sitting down with a blank piece of paper and going, well, what do I do now? Because when you're kind of locked in your classroom teaching all day, you don't get to see the work that the leadership team are doing. I just find that would have been so useful. I want to go back in time with it.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about is, you know, in some cases, some of our middle leaders are kind of new in post and don't necessarily have the mental models or even understanding things like the rhythm of year 11 and year 13, you know, like what happens throughout September to December, and then, you know, as you go through the year. So what we've tried to do is make a list of daily, weekly and termly habits, we're calling them, so to sort of help provide a framework there. So in a week, you know, on a daily basis, the expectation is the head department is going into lessons and is checking in with their team and just being really specific about the sorts of things that you should be doing. Because again, no one tells you how to do that. And so we're trying to take the ambiguity out of it and make it really clear so that people can be successful.
And it also, I imagine it's really helpful for the teaching teams as well, who aren't necessarily working within in that leadership layer, because they know what's happening when, and that also gives them an opportunity to ask their senior teams for advice, for support, say, you know, I know you're coming in next week to see this. I really want some help with this. Could you? I just imagine it's the transparency is it's like a transparent ladder, isn't it? You can kind of, everybody knows where they are on it, but it's not kind of like, not a big thing to hit people over the head with. I think it's wonderful. I didn't want to not have time, though, Aziza, to talk about some of your wider work that you're doing within the system, because how you fit this in, I'm not entirely sure. I'm convinced you've invented some kind of TARDIS or time machine where you've got 47 hours, so everybody else is 24. But your work around Mission 44, your work around diversity in headship, there is so much going on in terms of your wider work. Give us a flavour of what you're up to beyond the classroom.
Yeah, so I joined the Mission 44 board just over a year ago now. And I joined at a time where the organisation was still pretty young, so about 18 months into their journey. For those who don't know, Mission 44 was founded by Sir Lewis Hamilton, who had, an interesting journey in education, ended up being permanently excluded. And as a result, is quite passionate, I think, about education and opportunities for young people. So we invested £20 million into the charity, which is a kind of grant-making organisation, which is, it's interesting to be sat on a board where we can help to make things happen by giving people money, and that's really exciting. And so we spend a lot of time talking about where money should go and grant proposals and that sort of thing. And the charity does work in the kind of youth empowerment space, employment and education, has got some really big partners and is doing some work around things like exclusions, and that sort of thing, but also thinking a lot about diversity in education and leadership. They've set up a diversity in education fund to basically fund some organisations to try and increase the representation in teaching and in leadership, which is some really, really exciting work. I sit on the impact committee, which is pretty cool actually. You sort of hear these proposals from these like big teaching bodies, and then critique them, and then they come back with a better proposal, and you can kind of see it develop. So it's really exciting work, and obviously people on the board are just amazing, and I'm sort of sat next to a director at Netflix or some other amazing people, and there's just me. So that's really exciting work, and I really enjoy working with Mission 44, and there's lots of Teach First ambassadors and people that I know who've got kind of shared values that work in the organisation, which is really nice as well. So that's Mission 44. Separately to that, I helped launch alongside my co-chair, Claudinia Williams, a network called 100 Black Headteachers, which has been supported a little bit by Mission 44 and Teach First, with the aim of increasing the representation of Black people in headship. And I actually saw, I think, a recent article that looked at diversity in education, and I think there's been a marginal increase in like the gender gap, also a marginal decrease, I should say, in the gender gap. But the issue around people of colour has just not shifted. It's still very much the same. Many people will have seen the NFER data and that really stark graph about how it dips off. And so this network is trying to find senior leaders with a potential interest in becoming head teachers, and to support them with professional development, but beyond that with kind of networks to try and get them into a position where they can see headship as something within their sights, and then hopefully go on and secure those headships.
So what can schools, training providers, organisations, how can they get involved with that work with you?
So I think the best way to get involved with the work that Mission 44 is doing is to keep an eye on this Diversity in Education Fund. So the first round is completed, but I think there's potentially 2 other rounds which will look at different areas. So one will be more around, I think, larger multi-academy trust. There's some stuff around leadership. So I think it would be keeping an eye on that and thinking very carefully about, if we were to have a pot of money to try and solve this issue or make it better, like how would we use that money, and then start thinking about potential proposals to submit to that piece of work. And then in terms of 100 Black Heads, it's still very, very new and small, and the way that we're sort of connecting with the sector is trying to invite some big names into our network to kind of present, to deliver sessions. We have 3 retreats in a year, so we try and get some decision makers, CEOs, regional directors, people working in local authorities, people who will be sat at the other side of that head teacher panel making a decision about whether or not to appoint that person. And so those are the sorts of people that we really want to connect with, bring into the network to help us develop, but also build those relationships. That means that when we're ready to make that leap and ready to apply, that we've got some relationships that we can lean on.
And your work, this is so fascinating to me. I'd love to pick to pick your brains on what you've learned working with aspiring Black senior leaders. And maybe this is too kind of like blunt distinction, but to what extent is it kind of structures and barriers that are imposed kind of externally that's creating this sort of gap that you mentioned, and to what extent is it senior leaders that you speak to of color who say, no, not for me, for one reason or another? Are you getting a sense of?
Yeah, interesting. So I think that there is definitely lots of senior leaders who are like, this is not for me. And I think that those decisions around that are made really early on in their career, actually. And so when you're catching them at the senior leadership point, like they've spent a lot of time making decisions about what they are willing to do and what they're not willing to do. And they're also in a position at that point, I think, where they're more likely to have a family. And actually the reality of being a head teacher doesn't seem to marry with I've got young children and I want to be able to have a life. And so we are experiencing a number of senior leaders where that is the case. And it's making us think about how we can start earlier in the pipeline, although we're not in a position where we can do that piece of work yet. There are those senior leaders who, for example, we sort of introduced a network to them about 6 or 8 months ago. And one of our criteria for being part of the core membership is to want to become a head within 3 years. And they felt like that was definitely not something that they, could commit to. And now 6 months later, they're sort of like, 3 years doesn't feel like too ambitious, actually. Maybe I could do it within 3 years as a result of their interactions within the network. So whilst I think sometimes it feels a bit hopeless, like it isn't, and I think there are lots of senior leaders out there that with the right kind of support and encouragement potentially want to achieve that and aspire to be head teachers. I think in terms of what I've learned out of the process, there is a combination of external factors and internal factors going on. I think even in our kind of core team, like we have got some incredible senior leaders who, deputy heads, senior vice principals with incredible CVs, demonstrable like impact that they've had in their schools, incredible PAs, all that sort of stuff. And yet there is still an issue around confidence. Like they still don't believe that they have got the ability to become head teachers. We also have cases where like we've had several individuals who have applied for headships and haven't been successful. And there's conversations around like why that's the case and being able to tease out why, like what the sort of barriers are. I don't think we've sort of pinned it down, but the reality of it is quite challenging when you're on your second interview or third interview and you're not getting the job. Like what's the gap? What's not quite working when you've got this exceptional CV and everyone around the table knows that you can get the job. And it's also interesting where we get these facilitators in who have got experience interviewing head teachers and they spend a day with us on their retreat. And they're like, they can't understand why we're not heads yet. They're like, we can't, I've interviewed so many people and you are a cut above many of those people that I've interviewed, and yet you're in a position where you can't get headship, and we still haven't cracked it. But there's definitely some external and internal things going on.
Can I tell you about the punchiest conference talk that I ever saw? I can't remember who did it as well, but it was somebody, and it was not too long after George Floyd, where every organization, put a big banner saying we're an anti-racist organization, and he got screenshots of schools and multi-academy trusts who had made big announcements on how anti-racist they were becoming an anti-racist organization, and then he put a screenshot of their senior leadership teams and their boards to show how white they were. And so I guess to what extent do you think that we still need to like do that structural work? There was a recognition of kind of structural racism following George Floyd, and it does feel like that's kind of for lots of organizations, lots of schools, lots of trusts died away a little bit. That kind of looking at themselves. Does that work still? What do you make of that kind of work that still needs to be done?
Yeah, I agree. I think what's happened is trusts have tried to focus their energies around diversifying those who come into their various professional development programs. So whether it's an internal program or it's an NPQH or NPQSL or whatever it might be, is trying to diversify the individuals that get onto those programs, which I think is obviously an important piece of work, but it doesn't really tackle some of the core issues around the culture in some schools. It doesn't apply pressure to head teachers to try and think about what they are doing to make sure that the individuals that they've got in their schools, can see themselves in leadership positions if that's something that they aspire to. And then I think that we still have a massive problem around the central teams in academy trusts where it's just not diverse, like in the slightest. And I think your point about, boards is a point, well made. And I think it starts at the top. So we can do all this work, on the ground in schools, but if we're really going to see a shift in it, it starts at the top. It starts from thinking about the CEO, who's sitting on that table around the CEO, who are those directors? And if we can't diversify that structure, then we almost have very little hope of that trickling down into schools, is my view.
Emma's you're either choking her up with your moving words. It's so powerful.
Well, there's that, and there's the fact I'm coming off the back of a cold from last week, so I just had to mute my audio while I coughed really loudly. Aziza, that is absolutely. I wish we hadn't run out of time now, because I feel like we're just on the cusp of a huge other conversation. So we'd definitely love to have you back to talk a bit more about that. But we're getting the nod from Luke that we're over time. John and I are terrible for this. We keep going over time every single time. But I just wanted to say thank you, because I think when listeners are listening to this, we've covered teaching, we've covered curriculum, we've covered system-wide work on the work of Mission 44. We've looked at some of the issues that trusts and schools and organisations need to be having quite a long, hard look at themselves and their organisation. We have covered more ground here than most interviews we've done before. So thank you so much. Just testament to your deep and broad-ranging understanding of the sector. So thank you so much for coming on. Absolutely delighted to have you here, for you to share your thinking. What are you up to next, and where can people connect with you?
That's a good question. Well, I'm just sort of continuing with the things that I've been doing, really. So continuing, to push the work with 100 Black Headteachers and Mission 44, which is all exciting. And then, just really enjoying my day job and trying to continue to get better at senior leadership. In terms of where you can connect with me, LinkedIn, I'm still on X. I have a blog, although I haven't blogged for a very long time. So yeah, there's some old posts there that might be of interest, but LinkedIn, I imagine, is probably the best place.
Thank you so much. John, any final words?
I loved it. Whenever I mention Aziza to anybody and I say that I know and I've worked with her, their response is always the same, which is she's the cleverest person I know. So that's what people,
100%.
What I love that's come out of this is that you just have this amazing bias for action. Like, you just get stuff. Like, let's not just sit thinking about it. Let's get stuff done. Let's launch 100 Black Teachers. Let's do stuff. And so really, really cool to kind of hear more about that work, and hope people get in touch with you about continuing to accelerate it.
Amazing.
Thank you so much, Aziza. An absolute joy for coming on. Thank you so much, and best of luck with all of your latest endeavours. So thank you once again from John and I for coming on to Mind the Gap.
Thank you both.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host John Hutchinson. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel by searching Mind the Gap with John and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer is Luke Kemper.